An experienced fisherman noticed a strange hatch on a deserted beach. When he looked inside, he was horrified and immediately called the FBI. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Watch more videos on our channel, and make sure to share this video with your friends. The sea had a different voice after the storm. It no longer sang in its usual measured rhythm, but rasped and growled as if nursing some unseen wound. Along the Mississippi coast, near the quiet fishing village of Point Verde, the shoreline had changed its face. Entire sections of sand had been eaten away by the violent tide, leaving behind shallow pools and jagged drifts of shells. What had once been smooth and familiar was now twisted, raw, and unsettled. The gulls cried overhead, restless, as if even they couldn't recognize their home anymore. Nathan Jackson stood at the edge of his property, his old fishing jacket pulled tight against the cold wind that carried a faint tang of oil and seaweed. He was a man in his late 50s, tall, lean, with hands hardened from decades of hauling nets and salt-stiff ropes. The sea had shaped him as surely as it had shaped the coastline. His brown skin bore the marks of 1,000 sunrises on the water. His shoulders stooped not from weakness, but from long years of work. He had been at sea since he was 16, and though he had seen storms come and go, this one had been different. Longer, meaner, as if the Gulf itself had decided to rearrange everything men thought they owned along its edge. He had spent the past 2 days cleaning up what the storm had left behind. His wooden shack, perched on stilts at the mouth of the marsh, had survived by some miracle. The tin roof rattled in the wind, but the structure had held. The nets were another story, tangled, torn, some shredded beyond repair. He worked quietly, methodically, as the gray morning mist began to lift. Every motion was practiced. Untie, shake, mend, fold. It was the rhythm that had carried him through grief when his wife, Marlene, passed away 6 years earlier. The sea had been their shared life. The smell of salt and fish was all he had left of her. Sometimes he imagined she was still out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, watching over him with the same patience she'd always shown when he came home late from the water. He stopped to rest, wiping the salt from his forehead. The storm had ripped through like a curse, snapping boats loose, toppling the old pier at the east end of the village, scattering plastic crates and buoys for miles. The locals were still assessing the damage. Some had lost everything. Nathan had been lucky, but luck always made him uneasy. He trusted tides more than chance. He had seen enough in his life to know that when the sea gave, it usually took something in return. Late in the afternoon, when the sun finally broke through the gray, he decided to walk the coastline to check if any of his crab traps had washed up further down. He carried his gaff pole, the one he'd had for over 20 years, a solid iron hook with a handle worn smooth by use. The path along the shore was muddy, interrupted by new crevices where the waves had bitten into the land. Pieces of broken driftwood, twisted ropes, and bottles lay half buried in sand. The air was heavy with the scent of brine and decay. He passed the ruins of an old jetty and kept walking until the landscape became unfamiliar. This part of the beach was rarely visited. Locals called it Dead Man's Bend because the current there was treacherous, the undertow strong enough to drag a man under before he could cry for help. Nathan didn't believe in curses, but he respected danger. Still, curiosity had always been his weakness. He walked on, his boots sinking slightly with every step. It was then that he noticed it, an odd pile of stones arranged near a cluster of driftwood. At first, he thought the waves had simply thrown them together, but something about the formation made him stop. The stones were smooth, rounded by water, yet they lay in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. It looked almost like someone had tried to build a low wall or a ring. The longer he looked, the stranger it felt. Beneath the layer of seaweed and sand, the stones reflected light, not the dull gray of granite, but something sharper, metallic. Nathan knelt, brushing away the top layer of sand. The sound of the wind faded into the background as his fingers touched something cold and solid. Not stone. Metal. The surface was flat, hard, and slightly ridged, like the top of an industrial plate. He scraped away more sand, uncovering what appeared to be the corner of a square panel embedded in the ground. A fine line of corrosion ran along its edge, but it wasn't old enough to be a relic. Someone had put it there intentionally. He leaned closer. The thing was flush with the surrounding sand, cleverly hidden under layers of debris. The edges disappeared beneath the rocks. He could see, faintly, the ghost of a hinge, crusted with salt. His first thought was that it might be a remnant from the war, one of those forgotten coastal installations built to watch the shoreline for submarines. But the more he studied it, the less it looked like military scrap. The workmanship was too refined, the placement too careful. Whoever buried it had wanted it to stay hidden. The wind gusted, carrying a faint metallic hum through the rocks. Nathan straightened, scanning the horizon. No one in sight. Just the endless stretch of gray-green water and the distant line of pelicans moving south. A deep unease stirred in him. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of instinctive wariness that every fisherman develops over a lifetime. He knew when something didn't belong. This didn't belong. He told himself to leave it, to walk away, but he couldn't. He crouched again, touched the edge, and felt the faint vibration of hollow space beneath. That was the moment his heart skipped. There was something under there. Not a rock shelf, not buried pipes, something empty. Maybe a tank, a container, or worse. He didn't have the tools to open it. Not now. He would need leverage, something heavier than his gaff. The idea of prying it open alone on that desolate shore sent a chill through him, but he also knew he couldn't ignore it. The sea had a way of hiding things, but it also revealed them at the right moment, like secrets rising to the surface when the tide turned. He took a piece of blue chalk from his jacket pocket, the same chalk he used to mark his crab baskets, and drew a small line on the nearest stone. Then he stepped back, memorizing the landmarks. A bent cypress stump 10 yards away, a rusted buoy half buried in sand, the outline of the dunes behind him. He didn't want to forget this spot. Whatever was buried here wasn't drift or chance. As he turned to leave, something else caught his eye, a faint trail of wheel marks leading from the upper dunes down toward the water. The grooves were narrow, too small for a truck, too straight to be random. They reminded him of the plastic carts some fishermen used to haul gear, but no one worked this stretch of beach. He followed the tracks a few yards until they vanished into the wet sand, erased by the tide. It was as if someone had come here during the night, stopped by the stones, and then disappeared into the water. By the time Nathan returned home, the sun had already begun to set, painting the horizon in dull orange streaks. The marshes glowed briefly before the light died. He sat on his porch, staring at the horizon, the sound of frogs beginning their evening chorus. His hands still felt the cold of that metal plate, the memory of the hollow beneath. He tried to tell himself it was nothing more than a leftover hatch from an old well, maybe part of an abandoned storm drain. But deep inside, he knew better. It wasn't the storm that had brought it to light. It was time. Something that had been sleeping under that beach for years had finally decided to breathe again. He ate a simple meal, fried catfish and cornbread, and washed it down with lukewarm coffee. The house was silent except for the hum of the old ceiling fan. On the small table by the window sat a framed photo of Marlene, smiling, her hair caught by the wind. Nathan looked at it for a long moment. "Don't close your eyes to trouble," she used to say. "It finds you anyway." The words came back to him now, uninvited but fitting. He didn't know what kind of trouble lay under those stones, but he could feel it waiting. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell clanged, marking the rhythm of the dark. The beach beyond the dunes was invisible in the night, but Nathan couldn't stop imagining it. The metallic glint, the neat stack of rocks, the hollow echo beneath the sand. He knew he'd go back. The thought both frightened and compelled him. He lay down, closed his eyes, and tried to sleep, but the sea kept whispering outside his window, as if urging him to return and finish what he had begun. The storm had passed, but its work wasn't over, and neither was his. The morning after was still and heavy, as though the air itself had thickened overnight. The sea lay flat and colorless under a washed-out sky, and the cries of gulls sounded distant, almost muted. Nathan awoke before sunrise, as he always did, but there was no comfort in the familiar routine. The image of that metal surface beneath the stones had followed him through the night. Even when he had drifted in and out of sleep, he had seen it again, gleaming faintly through the layers of sand, patient, waiting. He brewed coffee, drank it, standing by the window, and tried to convince himself not to go back. He told himself that it wasn't his business, that storms uncover all kinds of junk along the coast, old sewer caps, drowned boat hatches, cargo debris, but the logic didn't hold. The memory of that perfect hinge, the clean cut of its edge, the way the air had pulsed against his palm when he touched it, none of that was junk. That was something made by someone for a purpose. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that purpose left traces. By the time the horizon had begun to lighten, he had already gathered his tools. He placed his gaff pole, the small crowbar, his folding shovel, and a flashlight into his old canvas sack. He hesitated a moment, then added a coil of rope and a pair of gloves. The wind had shifted overnight, blowing inland, which meant the beach would be quiet. The fisherman would be staying close to the harbor, repairing what the storm had broken. Nathan would be alone out there, just the way he wanted it. He parked his truck by the dunes and made the rest of the walk on foot, the sand crunching under his boots. The beach was still damp, darker than usual, and smelled faintly of diesel. The seaweed that had washed up formed long black ropes along the tide line. He moved carefully, scanning the horizon every few minutes, though he saw no one. The only signs of life were a few small shorebirds darting near the foam and a half-sunken log rolling with the surf. When he reached the place, he recognized it instantly. The stones lay just as he'd left them, the faint blue chalk mark still visible on one of the larger rocks. He knelt, brushed away the top layer of sand, and felt again that cold, unyielding texture beneath. It wasn't imagination. It was there, and now, in the light of day, the structure appeared even stranger. The surrounding stones weren't naturally scattered. They had been arranged in a deliberate pattern, forming a kind of border that disguised the metal beneath. Whoever had done it knew the sea's behavior well. The rocks would have held against casual storms and covered the hatch completely, unless the hurricane's force had peeled part of it away. He took off his gloves and pressed his hand flat against the plate. It was smooth, but not entirely. There were faint grooves along the surface, almost like industrial anti-slip lines, too regular to be accidental. The salt air had eaten into the edges, but not deeply. It wasn't ancient. He guessed maybe a decade or two at most. He began clearing the rest of the stones one by one, stacking them to the side. Each layer revealed more of the same: sand, debris, fragments of seaweed, and, underneath it, the metal surface continuing in a perfect rectangle. He paused when he found the hinge. It sat half buried on one side, two thick bolts rusted but intact. He ran a finger along the hinge line, tracing it to the opposite edge, where a recessed handle emerged. A handle, placed precisely flush with the surface, designed to be pulled up and locked down. He felt a sharp tightening in his chest. It was a hatch, and it was meant to be opened by someone who knew it was there. Nathan sat back on his heels, listening. The only sounds were the distant crash of waves and the low hiss of wind through the dunes. He could almost feel the emptiness beneath him. A hollow, a void in the earth that didn't belong. He used the crowbar first, wedging it beneath the edge and leaning into it slowly. The metal groaned faintly but refused to move. The hinge was stiff, sealed tight. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and tried again, this time with the gaff for leverage. The iron hook slid under the plate's edge, and with a heavy grunt he forced the crowbar upward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a sharp metallic click, followed by a hiss of escaping air. He froze. The air that rushed out carried a smell, damp, cold, tinged with oil and something chemical, faintly sweet. Not decay, not sea rot, something industrial. He stepped back, letting the hatch rise slightly on its hinges. The interior was dark, an almost perfect black. He shone his flashlight down and saw a narrow shaft, lined with metal rungs descending into shadow. The beam illuminated only a few feet before the darkness swallowed it. The air that wafted up felt stale, heavy with moisture, as though it had been sealed away for years. Nathan crouched by the edge, his heart pounding. The inside walls looked reinforced, not like any simple drainage pipe. They were made of steel sheets bolted together. Along the edge he noticed something else, a torn length of black cable, the end frayed, as though it had been cut. Electrical wiring, old but not ancient. He scanned the perimeter of the hatch again. There were faint marks along the inside rim, parallel scratches, like the imprint of tools that had been used repeatedly. Whoever built this place had opened and closed it many times. This was not a forgotten relic. It had been maintained. He reached into his bag and took out the flashlight again, angling it deeper into the shaft. At the bottom, just visible through the beam, was a small landing or platform maybe 8 or 10 feet below. Something metallic glinted faintly, perhaps a door or a continuation of the passage. He felt the instinctive tug of curiosity battling with a colder, older fear. Every part of him told him to go down, but the same instinct warned that some places weren't meant to be disturbed. He backed away from the hatch and sat on one of the rocks, breathing heavily. The wind was stronger now, pushing the smell of the sea into his lungs, clearing his head. He told himself to think. The presence of electricity, the reinforced metal, the perfect camouflaging, this was man-made, modern, and secret. No fisherman built such a thing. No private citizen had reason to. He looked at the ground around the site, and something else caught his attention. The wheel marks he'd seen yesterday were still there, though partially filled by fresh sand. They led from the dunes directly to where he now sat, and then continued a few feet past before fading. Kneeling down, he saw faint imprints of boot soles pressed deep into the wet sand, facing toward the hatch. The tracks were not his. The pattern was unfamiliar, thick-soled, industrial, like the type worn by dock workers or construction crews. He measured the depth of the print with his fingers. The edges were sharp, too fresh to be from before the storm. He straightened slowly, scanning the dunes. No movement, no sound beyond the waves. But the realization settled over him like a weight. Someone else had been here recently, maybe even after he left. Someone who knew the hatch existed. He crouched again, took out his piece of blue chalk and made a small mark near the hinge. Then, on a sudden thought, he brushed a handful of dry sand along the edges of the hatch, shaping it into a delicate ridge. If anyone came and opened it, that ridge would collapse, and he would know. He stepped back and examined his work, committing every detail to memory. The position of each rock, the slight tilt of the hatch, the lines of the surrounding sand. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at the opening. The darkness inside seemed almost to breathe. It was deeper than he could see, and the faint hum of the sea behind him only made it more unnerving. He imagined tunnels stretching under the sand, hollow arteries connecting to something larger. The thought made him shiver. He had heard stories of smugglers along the Gulf Coast, rumors of hidden caches and old prohibition routes, but this was no relic from the 1930s. The technology was too modern. He closed the hatch carefully, lowering it until it clicked back into place. The sound echoed softly under his hands, dull and final. When it was shut, it blended perfectly with the stones, almost invisible again. He covered the top with a thin layer of sand, erasing his own tracks. As he began walking back toward his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Once, halfway up the dune, he turned around and looked behind him. The beach was empty, the tide beginning to creep closer. The spot where the hatch lay seemed ordinary again, just a random patch of stones among hundreds, but Nathan knew better. He had seen its bones. By the time he reached the truck, his mind was already racing. If he told someone, if he went to the sheriff or the harbor office, they'd probably laugh, maybe send a deputy to take a look and find nothing. And if whoever had built that thing came back before the law did, there'd be no sign left. He needed to understand more before he opened his mouth. He sat in the driver's seat, staring at the water through the windshield. The tide was coming in fast, swallowing the footprints he'd made. In a few hours, the beach would look untouched again. That thought both comforted and unnerved him. Secrets didn't survive on land the way they did beneath it. Down there, the sea kept them quiet. On the drive home, he couldn't stop replaying the moment the hatch had given way, that sigh of air from below, the smell that didn't belong. He had spent his entire life among tides and storms, but this was different. This was something buried on purpose. That night, as darkness settled over the marsh and the frogs began their chorus again, he sat on his porch and sharpened the blade of his pocket knife. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone was steady, methodical. He wasn't sure what he planned to do, but he knew he would return. He needed to see what was beneath that hatch, to know why someone had gone to such lengths to hide it. He felt the same restless pull he used to feel before going out to sea, the mix of dread and purpose that always preceded discovery. The sea had given up a secret, and secrets once found had a way of demanding to be followed. Tomorrow he would go back. But not just to look this time, he would go down. The next morning dawned gray and windless, a stillness that felt almost unnatural after the restless churn of the past days. The sea lay silent as molten lead, a flat, endless surface without a ripple. Nathan sat on his porch, staring at it, his coffee untouched and cooling beside him. The decision he had made the night before was heavy in his mind, but now that daylight had come, it didn't feel like a decision anymore. It felt like inevitability. He couldn't ignore what he had found. He had lived his entire life by the sea, reading its moods and mysteries, and now it had shown him something he could neither explain nor walk away from. He moved deliberately that morning, preparing with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done hard work all his life. The canvas sack lay open on the porch table. Inside, he packed a flashlight, extra batteries, gloves, a coil of rope, a small crowbar, a piece of chalk, and his pocket knife. He added a canteen of water and a folded handkerchief. He hesitated before tucking in a little notebook and pencil, as though writing something down might somehow make it more real. Then he went to his truck, opened the glove compartment, and placed a folded sheet of paper there. On it, he wrote a single line in his steady, blocky handwriting. Went to the beach. If I don't come back, tell Sheriff Mayfield where to start. He didn't expect anyone to find it, but he felt calmer once it was there. By the time he reached the coastline, the tide was beginning to fall again. The air smelled clean but sharp, the way it always did when the Gulf had exhausted itself. The beach stretched long and empty in both directions, a smear of pale sand under the weak morning light. He parked near the dunes and made the rest of the way on foot, his boots sinking slightly in the damp sand. The sky was overcast, casting the world in a colorless wash of gray and beige. When he reached the place, he stopped to listen. Nothing but the faint hiss of the retreating surf and the occasional cry of a distant bird. The sand around the rocks looked undisturbed. His careful ridge of dust and loose grains along the hatch's edge was still intact. No one had been here. At least, not since he had. He knelt, brushed aside the thin layer of sand, and uncovered the hatch once more. The metal was cold under his fingers, smooth where the salt hadn't corroded it. He traced the edge of the hinge, felt for any movement, then slid the crowbar underneath. The hinge groaned slightly, protesting, but this time it gave way more easily. He pulled it up until it stood open at an angle, the smell of stale air and metal rising from below. The shaft yawned beneath him, dark and narrow, the same as before. The air was damp, almost oily. He tied one end of the rope around a thick rock nearby and looped the other through his belt. Then he clipped the flashlight to his wrist and lowered it into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same vertical tunnel with metal rungs leading downward. He could see a faint glimmer at the bottom now that the light was stronger, perhaps a floor or a landing, just as he had guessed. He took a slow breath and began his descent. The first few steps were steady, the rungs cold and slick under his boots. The walls closed in quickly, lined with steel sheets fastened by bolts, the seams sealed with some kind of rubber compound. Drops of condensation glimmered in the light as they ran down the walls. About halfway down, the air grew colder, and the smell of damp concrete replaced the salt. He paused, listening. Nothing. Only his own breathing echoing faintly in the shaft. Then his boots touched solid ground. The bottom opened into a short corridor, just tall enough for him to stand upright. The walls were gray concrete, rough and pitted with moisture. The floor sloped slightly, and a shallow trail of water ran along one side, glistening in the beam of his flashlight. The passage stretched ahead for maybe 20 feet before turning sharply to the right. Nathan followed it, stepping carefully, the sound of his boots muffled by the damp air. When he turned the corner, the narrow tunnel widened into a large chamber. It was an underground room, rectangular, maybe 30 feet long and 15 wide. The walls were reinforced with steel ribs, and along the far side stood a series of metal shelving units, most of them empty, but still in good condition. Against one wall sat a large wooden table, and its surface stained with oil and something darker. On the floor nearby were several empty plastic containers, heavy-duty ones, the kind used for storage or transport. A coil of rubber tubing hung from a hook above the table, and a small electric fan, long since dead, clung crookedly to the wall. Nathan stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The place looked abandoned, but not ancient. There was too little dust, too few cobwebs. Someone had been here not so long ago. The air held the faint chemical tang of solvent or fuel. He walked slowly, sweeping the beam of his flashlight across the floor. Scattered everywhere were scraps of black plastic, bits of torn wrapping, and what looked like fragments of packaging tape. On one of the shelves, half buried under a layer of sand, he saw a small stack of flattened cardboard boxes, their sides stamped with faint stenciled letters, R12 and BR Doc. The markings meant nothing to him, but they were too precise to be random. He crouched by the boxes and picked one up. It was clean, dry, the cardboard stiff and unbroken. That meant moisture hadn't reached this place in a long time. He turned it over and noticed a faint, oily residue on the bottom, the same smell he'd caught earlier from the hatch. He set it back down and moved toward the corner of the room where something glinted faintly in the beam of light. It was a small metal canister, no bigger than his fist, lying on its side near the wall. He picked it up and turned it over. The top was fitted with a screw cap and a faded label in Spanish, Lubricante Industrial, Puerto Lázaro Cárdenas. The words meant little, but the port was in Mexico. He exhaled slowly. This was no fishing supply. The silence pressed in around him, the kind that seemed to vibrate against the eardrums. He could hear drops of water falling rhythmically somewhere deeper in the passage. The light of his flashlight quivered as his hand trembled slightly. He walked to the far end of the room where another passage extended into darkness. The air there was thicker, heavier. He shone the light forward, but could see only more concrete walls, narrowing as they went. He hesitated, then stepped closer. The floor here was coated in fine sand, tracked with faint impressions. He knelt to study them. Footprints. They were unmistakable. Human. The soles patterned with crosshatched treads, the kind worn on work boots. Some were clearer than others, pressed deep into the sand. They led into the tunnel, then disappeared where the ground turned to solid concrete again. Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. Someone had been down here recently, not decades ago, days, perhaps even hours. He stood listening again. This time, he thought he heard something. A faint, metallic creak, far off like the echo of a door hinge. He froze, holding his breath. The sound didn't repeat. Maybe it was the shifting of the structure, or the water moving in the pipes above, but maybe not. He turned off his flashlight for a moment, letting the darkness swallow him, and waited. The silence was total. He could hear the slow pounding of his own heartbeat. When he turned the light back on, he noticed something he had missed before. Near the wall, behind a stack of old crates, was a narrow conduit running up toward the ceiling. It was an electrical cable, its end cut cleanly and hanging loose. Following it upward, he saw where it had once connected to a junction box, now empty. There had been power here once, real power, enough to run equipment, lights, maybe even ventilation. The generator or source had been removed, but the infrastructure remained. He took a few cautious steps toward the center of the chamber, shining the light in a slow circle. He could imagine it now. The hum of machinery, men working, the sound of crates being dragged, the hiss of tape sealing boxes. It wasn't difficult to picture. Everything about this place spoke of purpose, of organization. This wasn't a random hideout. It was a workspace. His hand brushed against something on the floor, a scrap of paper, curled and brittle. He picked it up carefully, unfolding it. The ink had run, but he could still make out a few legible words. Shipment due, night tide, confirm with harbor. The rest was unreadable. He stared at it, then tucked it into his pocket. The words were proof of what he already suspected. This was part of something larger, something hidden beneath the facade of the sleepy fishing coast he had called home for decades. He felt suddenly exposed, as though 1,000 unseen eyes were watching him from the dark corners of the tunnel. His flashlight flickered once, and he smacked it lightly, restoring the beam. He couldn't stay much longer. The air down here was getting thicker, harder to breathe. He took one last look around the chamber, then turned back toward the shaft. As he walked, he tried to ignore the persistent feeling that the sound of his footsteps wasn't the only one echoing in that tunnel. At the base of the ladder, he stopped to look upward. The circle of daylight above seemed impossibly far away, a small pale coin against the darkness. He began to climb, one hand over the other, boots scraping against the rungs. His arms ached. His breath came in shallow bursts. Halfway up, he glanced down, just for a moment, and thought he saw something flicker in the beam of his light at the bottom. A movement, slight, like a shadow shifting across the floor. He blinked, froze, waited. Nothing, just stillness again. He climbed faster. When he finally reached the top, he pushed the hatch open with a grunt and pulled himself out into the open air. The wind hit him like a blessing. He closed the hatch quickly, pressed the sand back over it, and stood there for a long time, breathing hard, the sea stretching endlessly before him. The sun had climbed higher, its light breaking through the clouds in pale streaks. The beach looked innocent, untouched, as if none of what he had just seen could possibly exist beneath it. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, turned, and began the slow walk back toward his truck. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the hatch open again, half expecting someone, or something, to be standing there watching, but there was nothing. Only the whisper of the wind and the far-off crash of waves. By the time he reached his house, the adrenaline had drained from his body, leaving a hollow fatigue. He set his tools down on the porch and washed his hands at the outdoor sink, scrubbing at the grime that clung to his skin. The water turned gray as it ran off. He looked at his reflection in the small metal mirror above the basin. The man staring back at him looked older than he had yesterday. That night, long after darkness fell, he sat by the window again, watching the faint glow of the moon on the water. He could not stop replaying the images in his mind. The cold metal walls, the footprints, the cut cables, the faint creak that might not have been the sea. The logical part of him tried to dismiss it, to say it was an old smuggling tunnel abandoned decades ago. But logic couldn't explain the freshness of the air, the intact boxes, the industrial canister from Mexico. Somewhere beneath that beach, something was still alive, or at least still in motion. He had only scratched the surface, and deep down he knew that what he had uncovered wasn't just a piece of forgotten machinery. It was a doorway, and doors like that were made to be used. He leaned back, the old wood of the chair creaking beneath him, and stared into the darkness. The sea murmured softly in the distance, calm and deceptive as ever. Nathan's instincts, honed by a lifetime of reading tides and storms, told him one thing with absolute certainty. He hadn't been alone down there. Not then and not now. The night after his descent was one of the longest Nathan could remember. He had tried to sleep, but his mind refused to quiet itself. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that dark shaft again, the cold steel walls glistening in the beam of his flashlight, and those footprints leading into the deeper tunnel. They haunted him, the unmistakable evidence of someone else's presence down there. Not ghosts, not imagination, but a real person, flesh and blood, who had walked those same corridors not long before. Who were they? What had they been doing? The questions coiled inside him like a knot he couldn't untangle. By the time dawn crept over the marshes, he was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The window rattled softly in the morning breeze. Outside, the first light of day cast the world in pale gray, quiet and fragile, as if the storm months ago had washed the color out of everything. He felt strange, half numb, as though the world above ground had become a thin shell stretched over something deeper and far more complex. He knew he couldn't keep what he'd seen to himself forever. Secrets like that grew heavy, like anchors dragging you down. But to tell someone meant inviting attention, and attention meant risk. He had lived long enough to know that once the wrong people started asking questions, things had a way of spiraling out of control. Still, he needed to make sure he wasn't losing his mind. Maybe, just maybe, the storm had exposed an old smuggling tunnel from decades back, long abandoned, harmless now. But then he remembered the smell of fresh oil, the clean cut of the wires, the sharp edges of footprints pressed into damp sand. There was nothing old or harmless about any of it. He stood, slipped on his jacket, and stepped outside into the still morning air. The sky was heavy with low clouds, and the distant horizon blurred where sea met sky. He walked toward his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots. He wasn't going back to the hatch today. Not yet. He had another idea. A few miles down the road, past the marshlands and along the old causeway, stood the remains of the Point Verde Fish Cooperative, a warehouse that had closed nearly 20 years ago. It had once been the heart of the local fishing community, where dozens of small boats brought their catches each morning to be weighed, packed, and shipped across the Gulf. But the business had collapsed after a string of bad years, and now the property sat abandoned, boarded up and weathered by salt. The locals avoided it, saying it was unstable, but Nathan remembered it well. He had delivered his first load of shrimp there when he was barely out of school. The memory of that place had nagged at him ever since he saw the boxes marked BR Dock in the underground chamber. BR could easily stand for Bay Ridge, the nickname the locals had once used for that same cooperative dock. It was only a few hundred yards up the coastline from where the hatch lay buried under the sand. The connection was too neat to ignore. He parked his truck on the gravel shoulder and approached the old building on foot. The front doors were sealed with a weathered chain and padlock, but the side entrance near the loading bay hung slightly ajar, its hinges eaten by rust. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the faint tang of decayed wood. Sunlight filtered in through cracks in the roof, painting pale stripes across the concrete floor. The cavernous space was empty except for a few broken crates and the skeletal remains of an old forklift. Nathan's footsteps echoed softly as he moved deeper inside. The smell here was familiar. Salt, rust, and something faintly chemical beneath it. He found his way to the back of the warehouse, where the cold storage rooms had once been. The heavy doors were still there, their seals cracked, the interiors dark and moldy. He opened one and peered inside, shining his flashlight around. Nothing. Just dust, a few dead fish bones, and the remnants of old packing material. But when he reached the last of the storage rooms, he stopped. The concrete floor near the back wall was cracked, the fissures running in a pattern too deliberate to be caused by age. He knelt, brushed away some of the dust, and found a faint indentation along the wall's base, a line, thin but clean, where the concrete met metal. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles, and the sound that came back was hollow. A door. Another one. The realization sent a shiver through him. It wasn't large, maybe 3 feet wide, disguised by a thin layer of painted plaster that had peeled away in places. But it was real, and the sound it made told him it led to open space beyond. He shone the flashlight along its edge and saw faint marks, scuffs on the floor, like something heavy had once been dragged across it. He stepped back, heart pounding. The underground tunnels he'd found on the beach. Could they connect here? If they did, it meant this entire stretch of coastline had been a part of a network, a system designed for concealment. The thought made him dizzy. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to build all this, and they hadn't done it for storage. He left the warehouse quietly, his mind racing. If there were tunnels linking the beach to the dock, it would explain everything. The fresh air below, the smell of chemicals, the cut wires. It wasn't abandoned. It had been used, maybe even recently. And if that was true, whoever had been using it would eventually come back to retrieve whatever they left behind. The drive back home felt longer than usual. The landscape seemed alien now, as if the familiar marshes and beaches hid countless unseen chambers just below their calm surfaces. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he sat for a moment in silence, gripping the steering wheel. He knew what he had to do next. It was time to call the police. He went inside, picked up the old rotary phone on the wall, and dialed the sheriff's office. The voice that answered was gruff and impatient. It was Deputy Warner, a man Nathan had known for years. When Nathan told him what he'd found, there was a long pause on the other end, followed by a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're telling me you found a hatch in the sand that leads to some kind of bunker?" Warner said. "You sure it ain't one of those old storm shelters? We had a few built near the coast back in the 60s. "I know what a storm shelter looks like," Nathan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "This one's different. There's wiring, fresh packaging, footprints. It's been used recently, and I think it connects to the old fish warehouse up the coast." There was another pause, then the sound of scribbling. "All right," Warner said finally. "I'll send someone out. Just stay put till we get there." An hour later, a patrol truck pulled up outside his house. 2 officers stepped out. Warner and another younger deputy Nathan didn't recognize. They looked skeptical, but curious. He led them to the beach, the same path he'd taken so many times over the past days. The tide was low, exposing more of the sand and stones. When they reached the spot, Nathan uncovered the hatch once more. The deputies exchanged a glance. Warner crouched, ran his hand over the surface, then rapped it with his knuckles. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's not something you see every day." They brought out a small crowbar from the patrol truck and helped Nathan lift the hatch. When it opened, the rush of stale air rose again, carrying that same faint chemical smell. The younger deputy shone his flashlight down the shaft and whistled. "That's no shelter," he said quietly. Warner grunted. "All right, we're going to need to get some folks out here. This looks like it might be part of something bigger." They radioed the sheriff's office, and soon another vehicle arrived with 2 more officers and a field investigator. Together, they descended into the shaft, leaving Nathan above, standing beside the open hatch, the wind tugging at his jacket. He paced back and forth, his nerves stretched thin. He could hear faint echoes from below, the sound of boots on metal, voices calling back and forth. Then one of the officers' voices rose sharply, echoing up the shaft. "You need to see this." Minutes later, Warner climbed out, his face pale. He looked at Nathan, then back toward the open hatch. "You weren't lying," he said quietly. "There's a whole setup down there. Shelving, boxes, equipment. Looks like some kind of storage facility, or maybe a distribution point." Nathan felt a chill crawl up his spine. For what? Warner hesitated. "Hard to say yet, but whatever it is, it's big, and it's not old. We'll need a full team to check it out." Over the next few hours, the beach turned into a hive of activity. Police vehicles arrived, followed by a van marked with the county investigation unit. They set up perimeter tape and began documenting everything: the hatch, the footprints, the disturbed sand. Nathan stood back, watching it all unfold, a strange mix of relief and dread filling his chest. He had done what he thought was right, but the sight of uniformed men combing through the place made him realize how deep he might have gotten himself into. By late afternoon, the investigators confirmed what he had suspected all along. The tunnel beneath the beach led directly to a sealed chamber under the old fish cooperative. They found another hatch, this one larger, opening into a space filled with empty crates, residue from packaging materials, and traces of organic matter that tested positive for narcotics. It wasn't a relic. It was a smuggling operation, sophisticated and extensive, hidden right beneath their feet. The news spread fast. By nightfall, the local radio stations were already talking about the Bay Ridge bunker, and reporters were calling it one of the largest drug busts the county had seen in decades. But Nathan didn't feel proud or vindicated. He felt hollow. The beach he had loved his entire life now felt tainted. The sea that had raised him had been used as cover for poison, and he couldn't shake the feeling that by uncovering it, he had disturbed something that would not rest easily again. That evening, as the last of the police vehicles left the shoreline and the tape fluttered in the wind, Nathan stood alone by the water. The sun was setting, turning the horizon a deep red. He could see the faint outline of the old warehouse in the distance, dark against the sky. The sound of waves was calm again, as if the sea itself had settled after revealing its secret. He didn't know what would happen next, whether the investigation would bring answers or only more questions, but he knew one thing with certainty. The world beneath the beach had always been there, waiting, patient and silent. And now that it had been exposed, it would never let him forget what he had seen. Even in the quiet hours before dawn, the beach was no longer silent. The familiar rhythm of waves meeting shore had been disrupted by the distant hum of generators, the sharp calls of men organizing equipment, and the flash of temporary floodlights set up near the dune line. Where once there had been nothing but sand and seaweed and the soft footprints of shorebirds, now stood yellow police tape, metal barricades, and a rotating guard detail stationed in shifts. The place Nathan Jackson had known all his life. The unassuming strip of coast where he'd walked alone, chased gulls from his traps, and watched the tide roll in for decades, had transformed into the epicenter of a full-blown investigation. He stood beside one of the marked patrol trucks, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his old jacket, his jaw stiff against the wind. The air was cool, scented faintly with salt and oil and something else, disruption. A few yards away, a team of officers was lifting equipment down through the hatch. One of them nodded toward Nathan as he passed, but otherwise they left him alone. He wasn't one of them, not really, and they didn't quite know what to make of him. To them, he was a civilian who'd stumbled onto something bigger than himself. But to Nathan, it was more than that. He hadn't just found a hatch, he had uncovered something that changed the very nature of the place he had always trusted. By mid-morning, the technical team had fully mapped the shaft and adjacent tunnels. A steel-reinforced stair was installed temporarily to replace the ladder. Once inside, they began logging everything: layout diagrams, chemical samples, boot print casts, fiber analysis. Nathan was permitted to descend one more time, this time escorted by an investigator named Fields, a lean, quiet man with a cautious demeanor and the eyes of someone who'd seen more than he cared to remember. "Not much surprises me anymore," Fields had said in the truck earlier, "but this is something else." Together, they walked the same path Nathan had taken days before, only now the passage was filled with the metallic clang of boots and the whir of camera drones mapping every corner. The chamber he'd first entered was brighter now, lit by temporary floodlights mounted along the walls. What once felt like an ancient tomb now looked like a crime scene. The shelving units were being cataloged piece by piece. Investigators in gloves and coveralls moved deliberately, collecting fragments of plastic wrap, zip ties, empty boxes, and stenciled packing materials. At one end of the chamber, someone had uncovered a small refrigeration unit hidden behind a false wall. It was inactive, but the power conduit leading to it had been in use recently, perhaps until the storm disrupted everything. Fields stopped by one of the metal tables and placed a hand on the edge. We've seen setups like this before, usually in basements, warehouses, not under sand. Nathan didn't answer. His eyes were on the wall where the cable had been cut, the one he'd noticed during his first descent. Now he could see where it had led, along the upper conduit, through a braced tunnel, and down into what they were calling the secondary arm, a narrower passage that stretched inland. That arm had been opened just that morning. The team had followed it for over 70 yards before it curved sharply and connected to the foundation of the old fishery warehouse. That, more than anything, confirmed the worst of Nathan's suspicions. The two sites weren't coincidentally close. They had been built together, part of the same design. Whoever had done this had engineered an entire hidden distribution hub directly under Point Verde's nose. The warehouse provided the disguise above ground. The tunnel provided secure, weatherproof storage and transfer points. And the beach, isolated, never visited, was a perfect fallback exit. Inside the warehouse, another crew was busy uncovering false walls and panels. Behind one, they found the remnants of a trapdoor camouflaged beneath rotting wooden floorboards. That entrance had been sealed with industrial adhesive and bolts, only to be reopened by the storm's flooding, which softened the foundations and caused a small collapse that exposed the edge of the passage below. The central tunnel between the hatch and the warehouse had been built with meticulous care. The walls were lined with prefabricated concrete slabs, reinforced with steel mesh, sealed at the seams with waterproof polymer. Drainage grooves ran along the floor and rubber wheel tracks indicated frequent movement, likely carts or dollies. It was an operational corridor, not an emergency route. As investigators continued their work, one discovery after another pulled the picture into sharper focus. Hidden in a storage cabinet near the warehouse tunnel junction was a bundle of records, shipping manifests handwritten in Spanish and English, many partially destroyed by moisture, but others intact enough to decipher. Though coded, the recurring names and dates suggested regular shipments through coastal waters. The manifests included abbreviations matching those found on the packaging inside the beach chamber: BR Doc R12 C5. The assumption now was that these were drop points or distribution codes. There were also fingerprints, both partial and complete. Analysts from the State Bureau were en route to compare them with existing records. The lead investigator speculated that at least some of the prints would match individuals previously arrested for trafficking along the Gulf. That theory was bolstered by the discovery of several empty duffel bags near the warehouse's hidden tunnel door. Standard issue, military-style canvas, each with molded compartments and traces of plant residue. In one of the sealed containers recovered from the buried room, technicians found samples of compressed organic matter, tightly wrapped in thermal packaging with vacuum seals. A chemical test confirmed the presence of high-grade marijuana, processed, packaged, and ready for transit. Given the volume of crates and empty compartments in the chamber, they estimated that hundreds of kilograms had passed through the location over time. The figure they settled on, tentative, based on shipping logs and known street values, exceeded $3 million in total product. That number shocked even the seasoned officers. Point Verde had never seen an operation like this, not even during the cartel scares of the early 2000s. While the forensic team continued its work underground, officers began canvassing the nearby properties, checking for anyone who might have seen something unusual during the last few months. Some remembered unusual trucks parked near the old warehouse at night. Others spoke of unfamiliar boats arriving on foggy mornings and vanishing before full light. A few dismissed it all, calling it coincidence, unwilling to believe their quiet town could be part of something criminal. But Nathan wasn't among the doubters. Every new detail fit with what he had seen and suspected. The tracks in the sand, the freshness of the packaging, the hidden marks, the deliberate engineering. This had been running smoothly for a long time, and it hadn't stopped until the storm ripped through the coastline and accidentally unveiled the truth. He tried to stay out of the way during those days. The floodlights, the camera crews, the tents pitched on the dunes, it all felt like an invasion. He would walk the perimeter quietly, watching from a distance, his thoughts heavy. Each time he saw someone lift another sealed crate from the earth, he felt something between satisfaction and sorrow. It had needed to come to light, but part of him still grieved for the loss of the quiet, untroubled place he had loved. At night, back at his house, he would turn the radio on low and listen as the news spread beyond the county. Largest hidden drug operation on the Mississippi coast, the voices called it. Sophisticated smuggling infrastructure hidden in plain sight. There was talk of state and federal agencies stepping in, of possible links to larger trafficking networks operating through the Gulf of Mexico. But Nathan didn't need headlines to know what it meant. He'd felt it in the ground the moment he stepped on those stones. He'd heard it in the strange stillness of the air beneath the hatch. And now he saw it written across the faces of the people in town. Fear, confusion, and something else too. Recognition, because the truth was beginning to settle in. This operation hadn't happened in a vacuum. Someone local had known. Someone had helped. These things didn't build themselves, and they didn't stay hidden without silence. And so the beach, once a place of solitude and ritual, had become a place of reckoning. Not just for Nathan, but for Point Verde itself. As the last of the investigators packed their gear late into the night, and the perimeter lights flickered off one by one, he stood alone once more by the dunes. The hatch, now sealed again under heavy lock and temporary cover, was marked with a warning sign and a strip of yellow tape that flapped in the breeze. He didn't need to look at it to know where it was. He would always know. The sea was quiet again, whispering to itself in the darkness. But Nathan no longer heard it the way he used to. The voice had changed. There was something beneath it now, something that didn't belong, but had learned to live there anyway. And, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure it would ever be silent again. The days following the discovery of the tunnels brought a weight that hung over Point Verde like a slow-moving fog. The news spread faster than the tide, and with it came whispers, speculation, and a subtle but unmistakable shift in the way people looked at one another. For a town that had prided itself on knowing its neighbors, on quiet dinners and long histories, it was a betrayal too large to ignore. Something so elaborate, so sustained, couldn't have operated in total darkness. Someone local had known. Someone had helped. Nathan felt it everywhere, at the gas station where conversation now fell quiet when he walked in, at the bait shop, where the shopkeeper gave him a nervous smile but avoided his eyes. Even at the pier, where old men who'd once nodded to him in silent respect now stood with arms crossed, glancing sideways. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was fear, maybe resentment, maybe shame. He had found something the town hadn't wanted to see, or worse, had chosen not to see. He tried not to let it affect him. He kept to his routines. He cleaned his nets, repaired the hull of his skiff where the storm had cracked it, and walked the beach every morning, even though it was now cordoned off by law enforcement. The hatch had been sealed temporarily with a steel plate and a series of motion sensors, and a state patrol SUV now sat at the edge of the dune 24 hours a day. But the beach belonged to him in a way the tape couldn't erase. It was still his rhythm, his ritual. What he couldn't shake, though, was the gnawing feeling that the trail led closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. The scope of the operation under the sand had been too refined, too methodical. It hadn't been the work of a rogue outsider, and the design of the tunnel alone suggested someone with marine experience, someone who knew the behavior of tides and the layout of local geography. That meant fisherman, or former fisherman. Nathan began to replay old conversations in his head, moments that had once seemed mundane but now felt stained with subtext. He thought of late-night boat engines humming out beyond the marshes, of solitary figures hauling equipment up from the docks long after the day's work was done. He thought of the way certain names had stopped appearing on shipping logs, only to show up again weeks later with stories that didn't quite hold together. And most of all, he thought of one man, Harvey Collin. Harvey had been his friend once, years ago. They'd worked the same waters, laughed at the same stories, even partnered on a few night runs during lean seasons. Harvey had always been different, though, ambitious, restless. He had a slick charm that could talk its way out of anything, and a knack for finding loopholes that made more cautious men uneasy. When the fishery cooperative shut down, Harvey had disappeared for a while, then returned with a new truck, newer gear, and an evasive smile. "Just got lucky," he'd said once, leaning against his outboard with a cigarette dangling from his lip. Right place, right time. It hadn't seemed worth questioning back then. Everyone was scrambling, everyone looking for some way to keep afloat. But now, with what Nathan had seen beneath the sand, those words echoed differently. He didn't tell anyone what he was thinking. Not yet. He needed something more than memory and gut instinct. So he began watching. Harvey's boat still sat in its usual place at the far end of the pier, a small aluminum skiff with a custom motor and a reinforced hull. It hadn't moved in days. His house, a single-story clapboard structure with peeling white paint and a crooked mailbox, sat 2 blocks from Nathan's own. At night, a light burned in the back room, but the curtains were always drawn. One afternoon, under the pretense of checking crab traps near the far marsh, Nathan cut his motor and let the skiff drift close to the rear of Harvey's property. The old boat ramp there had collapsed in the storm, but fresh footprints marked the edge, boot treads matching the same crosshatch pattern he'd seen in the tunnel. He took a photo with the cheap cell phone he'd begun carrying and emailed it anonymously to the field investigator, Fields. The reply came within the hour. Noted, you're not the only one watching him. That night, a cruiser passed Harvey's house 3 times, headlights dimmed. But what finally confirmed Nathan's suspicion came not from footprints or patrols, but from a scrap of fabric. He had returned to the old fish warehouse under supervision. Law enforcement had now granted him limited access, mostly out of respect, partially because he had become the unofficial mapmaker of the place. He knew its lines better than anyone, having walked and memorized each corridor before they even brought in their ground-penetrating radar. He was cataloging a side room, one of the cold storage units that had once been used for shrimp crates. Now it was filled with detritus, coils of synthetic rope, rusted pulleys, broken lanterns, but wedged behind a cracked refrigeration panel, he found it. A jacket. It was a blue canvas work jacket, the kind used by boat mechanics. The cuffs were frayed, the hem caked in dust, but stitched inside the collar, almost invisible in faded thread, were the letters H.C. Nathan stood there for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the fabric. There could be 100 explanations, but none of them mattered. He knew. The jacket, the boots, the late nights, the money that didn't match the story. It all pointed to the same conclusion. He turned the jacket over to Fields without a word. The investigator didn't press. They both understood what it meant. The arrest came 3 days later, quiet and efficient. Harvey had been at the bait shop, chatting with the owner, when the unmarked car pulled up. He didn't run, he didn't argue, he just watched them approach, stubbed out his cigarette and held out his hands before they even asked. His face was expressionless. As they led him to the vehicle, his eyes found Nathan's across the parking lot. There was no anger there, no regret, only recognition. That night, the town seemed to hold its breath. Some were shocked, others pretended to be. A few nodded grimly as if a long-standing suspicion had finally been confirmed. But the damage ran deeper than any one man. Harvey had not acted alone. He had simply been the most visible thread in a far larger web. Whispers turned to names. Other suspects emerged, quiet ones, hidden in backroom ledgers and anonymous docs. People who had signed their names to boat permits and supply invoices without ever asking questions. The investigation was far from over. For Nathan, the days that followed were heavy with reflection. He had helped tear something open, but what had spilled out was bigger than he could carry. At night, he found himself walking the beach again, past the hatch, now sealed under reinforced plating and guarded by rotating shifts. The wind had returned to its usual patterns. The sea moved with a familiar rhythm again, but its voice had changed for him. It was no longer just the place where he cast his nets. It was the place where truth had waited, buried and still until someone had the misfortune or the courage to pull it free. He thought often of Marlene during those walks. She'd always said that right was right, no matter who it hurt, but now he understood the cost of that conviction. The truth didn't just break silence. It broke bonds, traditions, the illusion that everything was as simple as water and sky. And yet, even as he felt the weight of what had happened, he also felt something else. A strange, quiet clarity. The kind that came only after a storm had passed, when the wreckage lay visible and honest in the light. In the silence of the dunes, with the wind in his ears and the salt thick on his tongue, Nathan Jackson knew one thing above all. He had not walked away. He had seen what the sea offered him, and he had answered. The town would never be the same. Neither would he. But the tide kept moving, and the beach, scarred as it was, still waited each morning with open hands. The night after the arrest of Harvey Collin was quiet, at least on the surface. Point Verde seemed to exhale collectively, the tension that had gripped the town for days lifting just enough for people to resume their routines. But Nathan Jackson knew better. Quiet on the surface did not mean quiet underneath. The underground network he had discovered, the tunnels beneath the sand connecting the hatch to the old fish warehouse, had not been fully dismantled. It had been disrupted, exposed, but pieces remained, and the people behind it were neither naive nor absent. Nathan woke before dawn as usual, the gray light barely seeping through his blinds. The wind whispered against the wooden shutters, carrying the scent of salt and decay and the soft hum of the Gulf in the distance. He dressed silently, checking his pockets for the small flashlight, the rope, and the notebook he had begun keeping. It had grown into a detailed record over the past weeks, diagrams of tunnels, notes about footprints, and sketches of the hatch and the hidden doors at the warehouse. He felt the weight of it in his hands, heavier than any fish he had ever hauled in. Stepping outside, he walked toward the dunes, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp sand. The beach was deserted, the tidal line undisturbed except for the occasional trace of a bird. The hatch had been sealed with a steel plate and reinforced locks, the temporary sensors left by the state patrol flashing red in the early light. Nathan approached cautiously, his gaze sweeping the horizon. The sea appeared calm, flat as glass, but he knew the surface often hid what lurked below. The tunnels remained, the conduits of a hidden operation still intact, a reminder that disruption did not erase history. It only revealed it. He crouched near the hatch, running his hand over the cold steel. The indentation of the bolts, the faint scratches along the edges, and the slight irregularities in the surface were all marks of intentional human activity, meticulous and deliberate. It was a place designed for secrecy, precision, and concealment, and even now it exuded the presence of the people who had built and maintained it. Nathan traced the outline carefully, committing every detail to memory, knowing that every imperfection told a story. From the dunes, he looked toward the old fish warehouse. Its silhouette was stark against the morning sky, boarded-up windows and rusting roof lines cutting into the soft dawn. The entrance to the hidden tunnel beneath it had been discovered, surveyed, and documented by law enforcement, but the building still carried an aura of quiet menace. The walls seemed to retain the echo of footsteps that had passed through them for years, of hands that had packed, stacked, and transported goods long before the authorities arrived. Nathan understood now that the place had been alive, a living system, maintained with vigilance and a strict routine that had allowed it to remain invisible for decades. The investigation had expanded beyond Point Verde. Federal authorities were now involved, mapping the tunnels, examining the underground chambers, and collecting evidence to trace the network to other ports and drop points. Every crate, every footprint, every fiber was cataloged and tested. The scale of the operation, Nathan realized, was vast, reaching far beyond the small coastal town he had called home. The local officers had estimated the value of the seized contraband at several $1,000,000, but the real magnitude of the network, the logistics, the routes, the people involved, was something Nathan could only begin to grasp. He walked slowly along the edge of the dunes, observing the patterns left by investigators, the temporary lighting, and the tape marking off restricted areas. The town's residents, he noticed, moved differently now. There was a tension in their steps, a cautious avoidance of the dunes and the warehouse. Conversations were hushed, glances fleeting and loaded with suspicion. Nathan understood why. The revelation of the tunnels had exposed more than a criminal operation. It had revealed that secrets could exist in plain sight for decades, and that the people around you might be hiding roles in those secrets. The notion unsettled him as much as the discovery itself. As he moved closer to the tide, Nathan thought about the men who had walked the tunnels before him. They had been careful, methodical, precise, and, in a sense, invincible until the storm came. The hurricane had been a force that neither the designers of the tunnels nor the operators could anticipate, a reminder that nature held the final authority over all human endeavors. The storm had unearthed what had been hidden and brought it to light, and Nathan, a simple fisherman, had become the witness to it all. He knelt on the sand, tracing the line of the tide with his fingers, and thought about the passage of time. The tunnels had been built with patience, with an understanding of tides, erosion, and the subtle movements of sand over decades. They had survived the neglect of years, the slow creep of rust, and yet they had not been impervious to nature. The storm had acted as both revealer and judge, unearthing the hidden veins beneath Point Verde. Nathan's role had been to observe, to follow the signs, to step carefully where others had moved silently. He stood and walked toward the warehouse again, now from the side, avoiding the patrols and the investigators. He could see the reinforced panel covering the tunnel entrance, the temporary supports, and the sensors monitoring for motion. Despite all these precautions, the building retained its presence, a tangible reminder of human ingenuity applied to secrecy. The walls seemed to hum with residual energy, memories of those who had carried out their work here. The shelves, now empty or filled with remnants, whispered stories of movement and purpose, and Nathan could almost imagine the ghosts of men stacking crates, measuring, and preparing for unseen transfers. At dusk, Nathan returned to the beach one last time for the day. The tide had risen again, and the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of salt, oil, and damp earth. The sensors flashed red against the steel hatch, marking the boundary between the world above and the hidden chambers below. Nathan stood over the spot where the hatch rested, feeling the cold metal under his fingers, tracing the faint scratches he had made in his first inspection. The place was quiet, but he knew it was alive in memory, in residual patterns, and in the data collected by the authorities. He thought of the arrests that had followed. Harvey Collin, the one person whose presence had been so obvious, had been taken away quietly, his face devoid of fear or defiance. It had been just the beginning. Nathan knew, without being told, that the investigation would continue, and other names would surface. Networks like these did not operate in isolation. The infrastructure, the people, the routes, they all connected to something larger. The web extended far beyond the dunes and the warehouse, across the Gulf, and perhaps further. As night fell over Point Verde, Nathan stayed on the sand, watching the dark horizon. The waves moved with their usual rhythm, indifferent to human concerns, yet the voice of the sea now carried meaning for him that it never had before. It was not just the movement of water, but a testament to what had been hidden beneath it, what had been exposed, and what might still remain unseen. He understood something profound in that moment. The sea remembered. It remembered every secret buried in its sands, every hidden passage, every clandestine transaction that had passed through the tunnels. It held memory in a way humans could not, and its rhythm, though quiet, was constant and enduring. Nathan realized he had become part of that memory now, a witness whose presence would linger as long as the beach and the tides themselves. The town would recover from the revelation, or perhaps it would never truly recover. The authorities would catalog the evidence, make arrests, and close doors. But Nathan knew the beach would always hold the memory of what had occurred. Every footprint, every channel, every steel plate hidden beneath sand carried a story, and the sea remembered all of it. He walked along the shoreline as darkness enveloped the town, the water lapping gently at his boots. The wind carried a chill and the distant cry of gulls settling for the night. Nathan thought about the people who had come and gone through the tunnels, the contraband, the maps, the manifests. He thought about Harvey Collin and all the others who had remained hidden, whose names he might never know. And he thought about himself, the man who had simply walked along a quiet beach, who had seen what no one else had, and who had been changed forever by it. As he finally turned to leave, Nathan looked back one last time. A hatch lay beneath the sand, invisible once more, sealed and reinforced, a door to a world that existed parallel to the life above. The beach was still, the sea calm, and yet beneath it the past persisted. The tide would come and go, storms would rise and fall, and the sand would shift, but the memory would remain, and Nathan, standing alone against the dark horizon, understood that some things, once uncovered, could never be forgotten. He walked home slowly, letting the wind pull at his jacket, the sound of waves echoing in his ears. The lights from the town glimmered faintly, warm and safe, but he knew the truth he carried was heavier than any comfort. He thought again of Marlene and her words echoing in his memory. "Do not close your eyes to trouble, for it finds you anyway." Nathan had opened his eyes, and he had seen. The sea would remember, the town would remember, and so would he. By the time he reached his porch, the moon was high, casting silver light over the dunes and the water. Nathan paused, looking out over the familiar landscape, now transformed in his perception. The hatch, the tunnels, the warehouse, the network of hidden corridors and secret movements. They were all part of the same pulse of life beneath the calm surface. And somewhere, deep in that knowledge, he felt the quiet resolve of a man who had borne witness. He went inside, closing the door behind him, knowing the world above could continue in its peaceful illusion, but the sea and the truth it held would never forget. Don't miss out on what happens next. Hit subscribe now and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to see our upcoming videos. If this story caught your attention, check out our other videos for more shocking discoveries and unbelievable secrets. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Let them see what's hidden just beneath the surface.